Hello, class, and welcome to our presentation, Plato, the Major Teachings. So we are going to talk about 4 of Plato's major teachings: his teachings on Platonic dualism, the pre-existent soul, the ascent to knowledge, and the ideal republic. So as you may recall from our lectures on the early Greek philosophers, Plato belonged to a school of thought referred to as dualism. And you may also remember this diagram here. So as we can see in red, Plato belongs to this school of dualism, which argues that there exist 2 independent yet interacting realities, one natural and one supernatural. Now, Plato's dualistic philosophy was influenced by his study of the eccentric philosopher Pythagoras. And as you once again may recall, as a dualist, Pythagoras argues that there exist these 2 independent and yet interacting realities. And so this was our previous diagram. So there we go. There are 2 realities as separated by the dotted line. And we have the transcendent reality of number and the immanent kind of reality of matter, or the world in which we live. And these two realities, which although are independent, they interact with one another. And how do they interact? Well, the reality of number feeds information to the reality of matter. So the reality of matter is basically built upon the information which is given to it by the reality of number. Now, rather like Pythagoras, Plato also argued for the existence of 2 independent interacting realities, one material and one non-material. But rather than the non-material reality containing number, Plato argued that it contains forms. So what are forms? Well, here is our definition. So a Platonic form refers to non-material, transcendent, perfect blueprints or archetypes. So Plato's forms are theorized to be non-material, right? So they cannot be weighed or measured. They are transcendent, meaning that they are beyond this world. They exist in another reality. And they are perfect, right? They are without fault or blemish. They are ideal. And they are blueprints or archetypes, meaning that they provide the information upon which the material world is built. All right, so at this point, some of you may be asking yourselves, alternate reality of these ideal forms, what is this grounded in? Well, think about it for a moment. So let's say that you wanted to build a house, like this nice little Cape Cod house right here. Well, in order to do that, an architect would need a blueprint. That is, the architect would need all of the measurements, all of the kind of, I don't know, geometric shapes and what, I'm not very good at math, but whatever equations might be like written on it, whatever. In other words, it would need some kind of like blueprint or archetype upon which to build this house. So one could argue that the second reality of the forms is doing exactly what we would do when we build a house. The blueprint is feeding us the information upon which the material thing, the house itself, is built. So put simply, maybe Plato's idea is not so crazy after all. So let's take a look at his dualistic philosophy. So as you can see on the diagram, we have the dotted line once again, which indicates the belief in 2 kind of parallel realities. And the first reality he calls the realm of being, or the reality of forms. And then we have the realm of becoming, which refers to the reality of matter. And the reality of forms is referred to as being because Plato argued that it is eternal and unchanging, so it's always in a state of being, whereas our world is always in a state of change, so it's the world of becoming. Now, instead of the reality of forms being comprised of purely of numbers, he argues that there exist these ideal archetypes, these perfect archetypes of many different things that exist in our world, and he gives us the different types. So first of all, we have what we might call moral forms, that is the forms or archetypes of moral principles like justice, beauty, holiness, and virtue. He does say that there also exist mathematical forms like certain laws of algebra, geometry, etc. And he says that there also exist these blueprints of quote-unquote physical forms like color, smell, texture, and shape. Now, out of all the forms that exist in this realm of being, there is one which is the highest form, which is the source of all of the other forms. And he calls this the summum bonum, or the highest good. And just as with Pythagoras' model, these forms feed information to the reality of matter. So the reality of matter is built upon the information provided by the realm of being. So put simply, our universe is a material manifestation of the world of forms. But our universe is what we call an imperfect copy of the perfect expressions of these forms. So they are flawed. So there's no such thing in our world as a perfect line, for example, or like the perfect color of orange. They're all kind of imperfect representations of the forms. Therefore, our sensory knowledge, so the knowledge that we gather from our senses, is, according to Plato, imperfect, because it results from observing imperfect natural objects that exist in the natural world. So the goal of the philosopher, and this is really important, is to overcome sensory knowledge, so to acquire perfect knowledge of the forms. Well, that sounds nice. I mean, who doesn't want perfect knowledge? But how do we attain this perfect knowledge? Well, for Plato, and this comes to our second teaching of the pre-existence of the soul, for Plato, our soul, our immortal soul, or psyche, already contains perfect knowledge. Well, how is that the case? Well, what we're going to discover in our dialogue, the Meno, is that Plato is going to argue that at one point our immortal soul existed in the realm of being. And that when the soul was up there, that it basically was able to see and understand all of the different forms in that world. So when the soul manifests itself inside of, in this case, a human body, it forgets that knowledge, but nonetheless it still retains it somehow. So if perfect knowledge of the forms exists within us, then how do we get it out? As I mentioned, we've forgotten it, so how do we extract it? Well, through the Socratic method, through this kind of question-answer method. And how does this work? Well, I'm not going to give a lot away because you're going to learn more about this when you read Plato's dialogue, the Meno. All right, so let's talk about Plato's third major teaching, the Ascent to knowledge. So the ultimate purpose of life for Plato is to achieve enlightenment, for the soul to ascend closer and closer to perfect knowledge of the divine forms. And what are the steps toward achieving enlightenment? Well, we're not going to go over this diagram right now, but in another presentation we will talk more about the steps upon which the philosopher ascends toward perfect knowledge. Now, the fourth teaching, the ideal republic. So, just as we had mentioned in our previous presentation, Plato's main motivation in writing his masterwork, The Republic, is that he wanted to offer an alternative form of government, which he argues is ideal. And what is the ideal government? Well, the ideal government of perfect peace is led by the enlightened, by those who have attained knowledge of the forms, by those who have ascended closer to perfect knowledge. And only the enlightened can implement perfect justice in society, because the unenlightened only know imperfect justice, right? So the unenlightened only understand the sensory world, but the enlightened understand the non-sensory or non-material world. Hence, the ideal government cannot be a democracy because it is governed by the unenlightened masses. And for Plato, why would you want society being governed by the unenlightened? It just doesn't make any sense. And as we shall see later, Plato supports an elitist form of government where highly trained philosopher kings rule over society. So not only is the purpose of life to achieve enlightenment, but the enlightened also have a duty to return to society and to govern it because they are the most qualified. So just something to keep in mind.